Welcome to EVA India Insights podcast. Today's episode explores how Indian steelmakers can treat ferrous scrap as a strategic resource, balancing growth ambitions with decarbonization and sustainability priorities. We're pleased to have Kapil Bansal, partner of energy transition and decarbonization at EVA Partner India, who shares insights on scrap availability, circularity, and the role of policy and infrastructure in shaping a sustainable steel industry. Hello, Kapil, and a very warm welcome to you, and we're delighted to have you join us today.
Thank you, Pallavi.
So, Kapil, to begin with, the ferrous scrap has traditionally been seen as a secondary raw material. So, what's changed today and that makes it a strategic resource for Indian steelmakers, especially in the context of cost pressures, energy efficiency, and decarbonization?
That's a very important question in the current context that we are facing today. One side we have logistics getting challenged because of some geopolitical issues. At the same time, the raw material availability on time at scale is becoming a very important challenge. And that's why what we see today, this ferrous scrap is no longer just an balancing material in the metal shop. It has become a very strategic raw material from an Indian steel transition perspective. Now, why so? Because there are multiple reasons to it. Scrap directly helps in reducing the dependence on most carbon and carbon intensive steel making, and that's where we see the current challenges in the energy sector. Where getting the energy raw materials is becoming challenge, and iron making itself is a major source for which they use coal and other sources of fossil fuel. And that's why it makes one of the solution um, in today's time at a commercial scale that can cut emission at the same time without waiting for the technological breakthroughs to mature. The second point is from a cost standpoint of view, steel making through scrap reduces the exposure to iron ore, coking coal, other fossil fuel-based energy, the logistics volatility, the supply chain issues. And that's why in our recent EY Parthenon report, we have made this point very clearly that Indian steel sector is under pressure to grow towards almost 300 million metric tons by FY30. Um, at the same time, we are looking to decarbonizing with the recent announcement in last Sunday where we talked about Indian carbon markets coming in. So scrap becomes an important resource towards overall, resource security, reduce dependency on imported materials and raw materials like coking coal, energy, fossil fuel, and other materials that are needed for our steel making. In other words, to be a very competitive lever, today environmental and energy security both have to go hand in hand. And that's why when we look in the recent report, we talked about, this scrap is currently being consumed at 41 metric tons, and roughly 85% of is used in steel making. But however, from an overall steel manufacturing, from the perspective of India's uh, current steel manufacturing, 23% of it is only contributed by the scrap steel manufacturing process, whereas the global average is 32% and much higher in other developed nations like EU, US, and Turkey. So there's a strategic importance through which scrap can not only bridge the gap between the raw material, the requirement of its growth and consumption, at the same time reducing its emission intensity, which is what is becoming as a trade barrier. Now, looking at the last 2 points, from a strategic lever for scrap as an important part, if I have to decarbonize today, and my 45% of steel making is through BF route, if you directly infuse scrap into the manufacturing process of BF route by roughly 15 to 25%, the emission intensity reduces by almost 11%. And we have those technologies, and without any major capital investment, it can be executed. So it becomes a near-term decarbonization instrument. And then finally, when we're looking for the way marketers behaving towards looking it as a strategic resource with all the geopolitical issues, the cost, the sustainability implication, the scrap itself has become a very strategic mechanism through which India steelmaking can become an important differentiator in the global context. So that's why, in nutshell, we can say that scrap has become a very strategic raw material for the steel manufacturing in India.
Thank you, Kapil. Now, India's scrap ecosystem is quite complex with fragmented collection systems and significant informal sector participation. So, what are the biggest structural and quality related changes across the value chain? And how can technology and formalization sort of help unlock a greater value?
I think that's the most important point. You know, when we look from an Indian scrap ecosystem, there is a complete fragmentation in the overall value chain. It the material which is scrap, which comes through uh, exchanges hands through multiple channels and intermediaries, and each one adds onto the cost, and also each one is completely informal, through which there is difficulties and challenges on three fronts. One is availability in a more consistent manner, the quality that has been what we received at our factory end is inconsistent, and then there is a complete challenges towards the traceability of it. So when we look the scrap in the overall system perspective, it's not collected very efficiently, it's not processed scientifically, nor it is delivered in the quality which is required in our modern steel plants. So if we look at each one of them, on a quality specific perspective, steel makers need scrap that is properly segregated, clean, graded, and processed. But much of the domestic scrap which comes through struggles through contamination, mixing of grades, poor sorting, inconsistent chemistry. And that's why in our report, when we have looked into this overall scrap value chain, we have understood India is in an underdeveloped collection, segregation, and processing system, because of which today we feel the utilization of this scrap from a domestic is not giving that much of benefit in our EF plants. Whereas the globally it's designed to run on a high scrap ratio, whereas in India we are first running it through the DRI process because of again the availability and the quality issues that we just talked about. Now, when we look from an informal sector perspective, the other important factor is there is unsafe dismantling of the scrap which comes through. The environmental controls are not in place. Most of the transaction happens in the cash mechanism with low focus on documentation, access to the capital, equipment, and the skills. Hence, one of the key elements of the parliamentary committee has captured that there should be a proper centralized database, the formalization of scrap market, and importance of organizing scrap dealers and collectors in the more structured manner. Now, you asked a very critical point, how to solve for this challenges. One of the things that we can look from the differentiation is bringing technology. What we have observed, digitalization makes it very transparent, clear, and most importantly, in today's time with AI coming in the report, we have looked into various mechanisms through which technology can be transformational in the overall value chain, such as AI-driven sorting, digital scrap registers, blockchain-based traceability, which will help in terms of overall improving the grading, reducing contamination, and building trust in the chain. These tools can basically help all the steel makers, the integrated steel makers, to verify the recycled content, the overall understanding of scrap provenance, and link the material flow into a proper emission reporting, which will then make them clear differentiators towards classifying them as a global green steel makers. Also, when we have looked into the overall white paper on scrappage, we have looked into one of the critical things of formalization of the scrap collection in the domestic market. While India has already classified two important policies, one is steel scrap recycling policy and vehicle scrappage policy. The next part of it is to build at the operational large scale, for which we need certified collection centers, authorized dismantling facilities, and establish and harmonize quality standards, digital payment trails, and better integration of how the vehicles, ships, and industrial scraps are overall streamlined. The the recommendation has also looked into creating a kind of web portal for all the scrap data, its certification, the availability of skill, the policies to help the organized economy to be flourishing from an unorganized. And then that's the way we can unlock the overall value in the overall scrap making, which will then become bankable, traceable, specification compliant, and investable. From all that perspective, these challenges can be overcome.
Thank you, Kapil. Now, if steel companies were to treat scrap as a long term strategic lever rather than a tactical input, what shifts are needed in procurement models, partnerships, and policy to support and strengthen the domestic scrap availability?
Clear. So we have looked scrap as a strategic lever, which is we are clear. There are challenges. Now, how do the steel makers make it an important element? Are dependent upon four critical shifts that we have also looked into our white paper. Number one, we have to change the mindset of looking scrap as an spot commodity to a more long-term data-driven integrated core raw material like iron ore or coking coal or any other raw material that are being purchased. That means that steel companies need to improve their visibility, not only in terms of their price at a spot market, but from a long-term perspective, look into the source from where the scrap is coming, the quality, the volume, the reliability, and also the emission attributes it carries with. In that context, also in the white paper, we have said that backward integration of the scrap value chain is an important factor because if we get into the overall participation of steel makers into the uh, purchase of the scrap from collection to its processing, we have observed that 14 to 16% of value can be generated by the steel makers in this process itself, and thus from a transactional activity of buying, it becomes a overall ecosystem ownership by backward integration. The second important factor beyond backward integration is also partnership, given that it is so diverse, India is so diverse. The steel makers should build and establish relationship the with the combination of policies with registered vehicle scrapping facilities. The India is the largest ship recyclers, so with the ship recyclers, the industrial scrap generators, the OEMs, and the overall construction demolition ecosystem, as well as with the organized scrap processors. These partnership will help them in terms of building a complete domestic loop of the overall recovery, reduce their dependency on import, have an established continuous structure on the pricing, and as well as reduce friction on the logistics or availability of such critical raw material in the overall context. The third important point is we need in terms of policy alignment. As I said earlier, there are two policies, steel scrap recycling policy of 2019 and 2021 vehicle scrappage policy. But there has to be a complete reform which has to be brought in the overall the recycling and the scrap policy. Hence, we have recommended certain uniform national scrap quality standards in our white papers, incentive for certified recycling facilities, looking towards stronger digital traceability, better integration of vehicles, ships, and industrial scrap. Also, it requires certain amount of public policy discussion, uh, which have helped in certain aspects, but there are further things that can be brought in, such as GST rationalization, which has already happened, viability gap support for shedding and the scrap pitch centers, which can be brought in from a VGF funding, and more transparent and domestic integrated scrap ecosystems are built, like what we have built the logistics parks. In a very similar manner, it can be brought. And finally, also there is a case from treating scrap value chain itself as a industrial sector in its own. RBI has given certain priority sectors. If we look from steel scrap sector as a more formally recognized, it will help in terms of improving the financing access, building the skills, certifications, and improving the public procurement preferences towards scrap-based steel, which will help in multiple factors, helping in achieving our goal of 300 million metric tons of steel, help in terms of reducing our emission factors in the steel sector, increasing job employment, reducing imports dependency, and thus we would be looking ourselves from where can I buy scrap to where we can start saying how I can build a resilience, low carbon domestic scrap ecosystem for the coming decade. And with that, we could be a much stronger economy.
Thank you, Kapil. And lastly, looking ahead to 2030 and beyond, how do you see greater scrap adoption reshaping the Indian steel ecosystem from MSMEs and recyclers to the country's broader net zero journey?
Sure. So when we are talking beyond 2030, let's see certain targets that we have created. So we are looking for under national steel policy, we are looking at 300 million metric tons of steel capacity by 2030 and further ahead to almost 500 million tons by 2047. To achieve all of this, we have to move India towards a more circular steel economy, whereby end of life steel from vehicles, building, machines, ships, consumer good have to be brought back from a fragmented channels to a more established channels. As you mentioned that there are MSMEs and secondary steel makers. For them, they have to increase their availability of scrap through structural changes, which includes that they should move from an unorganized to an organized scrap market with creating large-scale aggregation hubs, better sorting systems, standard grades, formal supply chain channels, um, improving their overall access to the raw material along with reducing their inventory risk. In our paper, we have talked about creating certain regional scrap hubs, which could help a lot of these MSMEs and steel makers to create the future of secondary steel markets, which will then contribute to the overall capacities that we are looking at. From a recycle standpoint of view, it would provide equal significant opportunities because with the formalization of this sector from a low productive dismantling to high value processing towards their forward integration on shredding, baling, sorting, certified grading, and digital traceability will make them in the mainstream of their working hand in hand with the larger integrated steel makers towards getting financing, better skilled labor, safer operations, more uh, availability towards capital, and then finally, part of the larger ecosystem through the formalization of scrap dealers towards a more professional recycler sector over the time. So this is more from when you look for the sector players. When you look from a standpoint of view, decarbonization, scrap adoption is the only practical lever which has the highest contribution towards the overall growth of the steel manufacturing as well as reduction of emissions and then also reducing the cost associated with it. So in our paper, again, we have clearly said scrap is an essential India's journey towards competitive, both from the scale and cost, low carbon, and the resilience towards the steel making. And IA also is positioning recycling material efficiency as an important path way for steel sustainable manufacturing. And finally, from what we have projected under optimistic scenario, while India might face 40 to 50 million tons of scrap deficit by 2050, but if we are aiming for a 50% of steel making coming from ferrous scrap by 2047, we need to increasingly adopt the scrap value chain We have to build the overall domestic ecosystems towards adoption of the scrap collection, sorting, grading, processing, and then its utilization. So at the end, if I would like to sum up in one line for this current podcast that we have, I would say that greater scrap adoption can help India turn steel manufacturing from a linear resource intensive model into a more circular, competitive, climate aligned industrial structure. If cycling, policy, technology, and the overall procurement ecosystems evolve together as we are looking for a brighter future.
Thank you, Kapil. Now, that brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing all your perspectives on ferrous scrap as a strategic lever for Indian steel industry.
Thank you, Pallavi. It was lovely talking to you. Those questions were quite enriching and helpful for me to answer them in the possible time we had.
Thank you, Kapil. And to all our listeners, thanks for tuning in to the EVA India Insights podcast. We look forward to bringing you more conversations on energy transition and sustainability industry. Until next time, this is Pallavi signing off.